we're going to talk about a topic that you may not have considered before, but it's the relationship between water pollution and brain health specifically. So we'll jump right in. When we think about water in and of itself, we understand that water is all around us. So about 70% of the Earth's surface is covered in water, and the oceans hold more than 95% of all of Earth's water. We know that water exists in many different forms. So water exists in water vapor, in rivers, lakes, glaciers, but it's also in the ground. It's also in the soil as well. We know that most of the water on Earth's surface is actually salt water, and less than 5% of all water is the fresh water that we actually need to be able to survive. 68% of our fresh water is actually kept in glaciers and ice, and about 30% of fresh water is actually in the ground. Rivers are the primary source of fresh water that we use as human beings, but they only make up actually about 1/10,000th or 1% of the total water on Earth. So you think about the fact that we're surrounded by water, and yet the water that's actually accessible to us that we use is really a very, very small percentage of that. So how does water stay on Earth in and of itself? A little bit of a throwback to maybe elementary school when you learned initially about the water cycle. So we understand with regards to the water cycle, there's precipitation. Precipitation leads to things like surface runoff, which often turns into groundwater. Groundwater then is evaporated from the ground, but you also have evaporation of water from oceans, like stream, et cetera. You have transpiration from plants, and then you have condensation back into clouds and subsequently precipitation thereafter. So what is water to human beings? What is water for us? So approximately 60% of the adult human body is actually water. Your brain and your heart are about 73% water. Your muscles are almost 80% water. And even your bones are actually about 30% water. We need approximately 2 to 3 liters of water every day to be able to survive. This water is obtained through food sources as well as the consumption of water in and of itself. We can survive a significant amount of time, obviously, without food, but we actually can only survive a couple of days, truth be told, without water. When we think about what does water do, so we know water is involved in many different processes in the body, from saliva and production of saliva and keeping the mucosal membranes moist to helping with regulation of body temperature. We also know that water is incredibly important for things like helping to deliver oxygen all over the body, helping with lubrication of joints, and many other things, including brain function, for example, manufacturing of specific hormones and neurotransmitters that are important for our overall neurological health. So, despite the importance of water, we know, unfortunately, that there are significant issues with regards to water pollution. Hence, there's something in the water. So many of us are familiar, if you've seen the news, with a number of incidents that have occurred, not only across the globe, but even in California alone, some of them actually in our own backyard, with regards to oil spills and other environmental disasters, so to speak, with regards to our water. One of the newest things is the idea of forever chemicals or forever plastics, for example, that are actually in all of our water sources and are making their way regularly into the water that we consume and that we use for other purposes as well. And so when we think about water pollution, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what exactly is water pollution? So water pollution occurs when harmful substances, typically chemicals, microorganisms, microplastics, et cetera, get into a stream, river, lake, ocean, aquifer, or other body of water. This thereafter reduces the quality of the water and can actually make the water harmful or toxic to humans as well as other individuals or other life forms, excuse me. So how does water pollution actually occur in and of itself? Well, there's multiple sources, unfortunately, of water contamination that can occur. So when we think about agricultural and we think about growing of crops, we understand that many of the pesticides, the fertilizers that are used, they ultimately will end up within the ground and end up in different sources of groundwater. When we think about industry as well, we think about chemical spills and some of these forever chemicals that we mentioned, these also will actually end up in the ground and end up in some of our groundwater. In terms of disposal of waste, so we understand that, we're reliant on things like landfills to be able to get rid of a significant amount of waste that we generate. However, the trash and the different chemicals and pollutants that exist within the landfills, they actually also get into the ground and thereafter get into our groundwater. We think of other things as well from an individual basis, our own homes. We think about the septic tanks that we have for our own homes. We think about the copper and lead pipes that we actually have that actually get our water to us in many ways. These can actually be a source of groundwater pollution as well. And then we also think, of course, of things like smog and other air pollutants that actually can result in things like acid rain and pollution of the rain that we get from above. So a little bit more about how does water pollution actually occur in and of itself. We're going to talk about some of the main sources today. So agricultural contamination is one of the main sources of groundwater pollution and freshwater pollution. So farming and livestock use up to about 70% actually of Earth's surface fresh water. Every time, however, it rains, we understand that fertilizer, pesticides, and even animal waste wash actually into our waterways and actually get into our groundwater. We understand that nutrient pollution, so excessive amounts of nitrogen, et cetera, is actually the #1 threat to water quality worldwide, given that it promotes harmful algae growth. Okay. So other ways in which water pollution occurs, so thinking about sewage and wastewater. So we understand wastewater to be used water from our sinks, from things like industrial plants, stormwater runoff. This is the rainwater that carries debris and chemicals, obviously from the roads into the waterways themselves. Over 80% of the wastewater in the world that's generated actually flows back into the environment completely unaltered. So when we think about this, we know actually up to about 850 billion gallons of untreated water is released into nature each year by the actual treatment facilities in the US. So even among the water that's getting to treatment facilities, there's still a significant amount of untreated water that is flowing back into the environment. We know untreated water is water that is spilled still with contaminants as well as pollution. The idea behind the treatment facility is that the treatment facility actually reduces the number of pollutants in the water before releasing it back into nature. But unfortunately, many of the treatment facilities are antiquated. They're not really up to par with regards to how they should be performing in this process. Other ways in which water pollution occurs, so oil pollution. So 50% of the approximately 1 million tons of oil that makes its way into the oceans each and every year actually comes from things like factories, farms, and cities, and not big tanker oil spills. That said, we know that tanker spills still actually account for about 10% of the oil in waters around the world. We know that regular operations of the shipping industry itself contribute to about 35% of the oil in the waters around the world. And oil is actually naturally released from under the ocean floor too into the water. And then finally, radioactive substances. So we know radioactive waste is generated from a number of different processes, including mining, testing of military weapons, et cetera. One of the things about radioactive substances is that they can last within the environment for thousands of years. They're very, very hard to get rid of, much like plastics are very hard to get rid of. There have been a number of issues over the course of time with regards to improperly disposed of radioactive waste that can lead to things like groundwater, surface water, and ocean water contamination. So we've taken a bit of a broad examination of water pollution specifically. How does water pollution occur? What are the different ways in which it might happen? What is water pollution? What about water pollution more locally, though? So this is something that we obviously should care about tremendously, is the water pollution in and around San Francisco. How are we doing in terms of our water quality compared to other parts of the country and other parts of the world? So thankfully, there are actually ways to be able to investigate this. There are actually a number of different reporting agencies that report out how polluted the water in San Francisco is. And the bottom line is that we're actually doing fairly well compared to many other places around the country and around the world. So there is a program called the Beach Monitoring Program, which is a cooperative effort between the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, as well as the San Francisco Department of Public Health. And as part of this collaborative effort, they actually collect samples of ocean water weekly throughout the entire year. They do some additional monitoring as well whenever there is kind of a concern for elevated levels of pollutants within an ocean water source. And what we're looking at here is a map, actually, of the different beach areas around San Francisco. And the different dots here, you can see they're all basically green or white. The different dots and their color indicate essentially the water quality for any 24-hour sampling period. And so the green dots indicate water that meets basically the state of California bacteria standards, in particular for water contact recreation. So your ability to essentially go into the water at these different points of entry. You can see different colors mean different things. So orange means concentrations of bacteria elevated. The clear dots, which is the other color that really makes up a number of kind of different beaches on the map, is that the location is actually not routinely sampled. And so there's not as much data available at this time. There are other ways to investigate the quality of our water. So we talked a little bit about beach water in the last slide, but we actually can also look at the quality of our tap water through a number of different sources. So the EWG, the website is down here in the bottom left-hand corner, ewg.org. It's actually the Environmental Working Group, which is by the California State Water Resources Control Board. This website also has information actually from the US EPA. And so the data that is kept on this website is data from 5 to 6 years, data from most recently about 2013 to about 2019, give or take. And the EWG really reports details about the contaminants that are found in tap water specifically. And so this is an example of one of the reports for the tap water in San Francisco from recently. And it essentially outlines how many, which specific chemicals or which specific contaminants exceed the EWG health guidelines. And so you can see that there, in this example, there were six actually, technically. This is a little bit erroneous, but there were 6 actually that exceeded basically EWG's health guideline. And these included carbon tetrachloride, chromium, and a couple of others as well. And so they give you actually the EWG health guideline for these different contaminants. They actually give you the legal limit as well. So a number of these contaminants actually have legal limits assigned to them. The EWG is actually a little bit more stringent than some of the legal limits in and of itself. And so you may have elevations of some chemicals beyond the EWG health guidelines, but they're still actually within the legal limits per se. But this is just another way to be able to essentially monitor kind of the quality of your tap water. One of the questions that might be asked is, why are the legal limits for some of these contaminants different from the EWG limits? And it has to do a little bit with the federal government and how they essentially haven't necessarily kept up to date with regards to legal limits for contaminants. So they haven't updated legal limits for many contaminants for actually 20 years in some instances. And so EWG oftentimes will exceed the standards that are set by the federal government just because some of the federal legal limits could be argued that they're a little bit outdated at this point. So we've talked about beach water. We've talked a little bit about tap water. We know that there are other water sources, though, correct? We know one of the main water sources is actually groundwater, particularly important. And so when we look at groundwater, again, you can actually access this data that I'm presenting. The website is down here in the bottom left-hand corner. But this is actually water quality data for San Francisco local groundwater. This is actually taken from a couple of years ago. This is taken from 2020. And what you're provided here is you're provided essentially a name of the detected contaminants within the groundwater, including kind of what type of contaminants we're talking about, whether they're inorganics or volatile organics, et cetera. You're given the unit of measurement, and then you're given as well a couple of different things. So you're given the range of kind of contaminants that essentially are considered okay. And then you're actually given an average of the contaminant concentration as well. This source also actually gives you kind of the major sources within the drinking water as well. So where are these contaminants essentially coming from, so to speak? And so, for example, if you look at something like carbon tetrachloride and how it's getting into groundwater and how it's potentially getting into something like drinking water, this is actually a commercial and industrial solvent that they use in dry cleaning, more often prior to 1960, so to speak. So again, just another way for you to be able to monitor actually what is in groundwater specifically. So as I kind of alluded to, you're given concentrations, you're given averages of these contaminants. It's important to note that these averages are indicative of actually raw groundwater quality. So this is groundwater that is basically essentially completely untreated, so to speak. And so none of the water in our distribution system is actually completely raw, in that it's actually treated and it actually goes through a number of different processes to try to clean it up. Okay, so getting into a couple of specifics about water pollution and brain health, which is really the focus of our conversation today. There are a couple of different contaminants that I want to point out to you and make you aware of. So when we think about lead, I think this is an easy one to think about. Many of us are familiar with, unfortunately, the negative impacts of lead on neural development. So when we think about lead being particularly damaging, unfortunately, to the developing fetus and the neonatal brain. Even very low dose exposure of lead actually can unfortunately affect cognition and behavior. Many of us think about consumption of lead chips for children and very young persons and how that actually can negatively affect development. We know that actually prenatal lead exposure can have a delayed long-term consequence. And there's actually even some evidence to suggest that it can actually influence Alzheimer's disease pathology pathways later on down the road, although more research is needed in this area. Aluminum. So we found elevated aluminum actually in post-mortem brains of Alzheimer's, of individuals who have had Alzheimer's disease, including actually within the cerebral arteries of Alzheimer's disease patients. There's a prevalence actually of kind of Alzheimer's disease in a dose-dependent manner, where if you look at a couple of epidemiological studies that have been done, very high concentrations of aluminum within the drinking water supply have actually been associated with greater rates in terms of prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. A couple of other substances and pollutants to be thinking about, again, talking about heavy metals in particular. We'll talk a little bit about organic materials and other things in a minute. Copper. So copper we know is important. Copper actually has a biological role in our bodies, but copper actually in our bodies exists within very small amounts. It's also important to note that there are different forms of copper. There's free copper versus bound copper, and depending on what type it is, it has a different impact on the body itself. There are some studies to suggest that non-ceruloplasmin bound copper is actually increased in the blood of individuals who have Alzheimer's disease and patients who also have cerebrospinal fluid, of individuals who have Parkinson's disease in some studies. There's also some evidence to suggest that low dose exposure to copper in the drinking water actually increases markers of oxidative stress within the brain of some animals in which they have kind of studied this further. Arsenic and cadmium. So arsenic exposure is linked also to neurodevelopmental abnormalities. Arsenic, interestingly, actually promotes the accumulation of a protein called alpha-synuclein, which is the protein that plays a critically important role in the development of Parkinson's disease. Low doses of cadmium in the drinking water can actually also promote excess free radical related oxidative events. And we know that the brain seems to be more sensitive to changes in things like arsenic and cadmium exposure compared to other organs. Finally, speaking just a little bit about methylmercury. So there was a study actually of 129 men and women living in 6 villages in Brazil, where they looked at concentrations of hair mercury, and they looked actually at whether or not there was association between concentrations of hair mercury and motor speed, hand dexterity, as well as concentration ability. And what they found was that individuals who had higher concentrations of hair mercury had reduced motor speed, less manual dexterity, and poor concentration. These villages along this river in Brazil is notorious, I believe, for elevated concentrations of mercury because of pollutants as well as other sources as well. Switching gears just a little bit, talking about organic materials and what do organic materials do to our brain health. So some of the more common organic materials, halogenated residues. So these are substances that are used, for example, as electrical insulators, fire retardants, pesticides are a big one, obviously organophosphates. We know that these can actually selectively target certain biological sites, and they can actually impede these biological sites, their function for very long periods of time. This actually occurs throughout the entire body, but we know that these sites also exist within the brain in and of itself. Other things that are important to know in terms of organic materials, so acrylamide and BPA, we know that there have been cases actually of poisoning from acrylamide from individuals who have consumed water from recently grouted pipes, wells. When we think about the neurotoxic effects actually of acrylamide, we think of things like ataxia, hallucinations, memory disturbance as well, because it's a neurotoxic substance. When we think about BPA, this is a substance that many of us actually may be more familiar with because we see labels for BPA-free products, for example. But we know BPA is actually a developmental toxin and it's a carcinogen as well. It causes neuronal apoptosis or cell death, along with metabolic and behavioral changes that can be significant. And so this slide is a little bit hard to read, my apologies, but I'll try to walk through it. One of the questions is, well, if we know based on these research studies that there's an association between a lot of these pollutants and detriment in terms of our brain health, what is the actual mechanism by which this is potentially occurring? And so if we think about mechanism potentially, we go back to our different sources of pollution in terms of our water. So we think, for example, about industrial or agricultural waste. We think about contaminants within the water conduits themselves. These oftentimes lead to a presence of heavy metals as well as organic materials in the water that we actually consume. Consuming this water that's laden with these contaminants leads to induction of kind of pro-oxidant inflammatory events within the body, but also specifically within the central nervous system. Having this ongoing process actually leads to elevated abnormals of apoptosis or cell deaths, along with system degradation and even developmental delays. And the downstream consequence of these is actually suboptimal brain development very early on, but also accelerated neurosenescence and actually increased incidence of neurodegenerative disease in and of itself. So just an idea of how we actually get from, say, improper dumping procedures in the ocean and pollution of our groundwater to an actual increased incidence of something like Alzheimer's disease in a region of the world where water pollution is a significant problem. Okay, a couple of other studies just to go through and some more data to share with you. So these are, what we're looking at is a chart. We're looking at results actually from a global ecological study looking at the association between neurological disorders, including Alzheimer's and dementia, and water, and what's called a water sanitation index, essentially. So the higher the sanitation index, the worse the water pollution or sanitation, so to speak. And so what we see is actually the incidence and prevalence of neurological diseases in areas of the world with a water sanitation index greater than 75%. So we think about this is less than 25%, it's 50 to 75, is greater than 75%. What we see is the incidence and prevalence of neurological diseases in these areas of the world are up to 1.25 times greater than the incidence and prevalence of these same neurological conditions in areas of the world where the water sanitation index is less than 25%. So you can see the clustering of blue kind of dots here, as well as here, compared to the clustering of kind of magenta dots here and here. And this is, again, demonstrating that living in an area with poor water quality is associated actually with increased incidence and prevalence of a host of neurological diseases throughout the world, including Alzheimer's as well as dementia. Okay, so finally, just to finish up, and then we'll have quite actually a bit of time for questions. One of the questions that we may be asking ourselves is, well, what can I actually do about water pollution in my home? What can I actually do about water pollution in my community, so to speak? This is something that, I care about. This is something that I want to be able to take action with regards to. And so what can you do actually about water pollution? It's important to really note that we all generate pollution of our waterways in some sort or another, whether it's the houses that we live in, whether it's how we dispose of things like household chemicals, et cetera. We actually all contribute in some way, shape, or form to water pollution. It's just a matter of how much do we contribute and can we actually do better, so to speak. And so one of the ways to do better is to make sure that you dispose of household chemicals properly. So many of us have a habit, I would call it, a not great habit of dumping household cleaners, for example, bleach, other things as well, down the sink. It's important to note that everything that comes out of our sink ends up in our waterways in some way, shape, or form. We talked about this earlier. So avoiding actually dumping household chemicals into our sink is one way to help reduce the amount of water pollution that we're responsible for. There are a number of biodegradable cleaners and house products also that actually are available for purchase now that are a little bit more environmental friendly and don't contribute as much to water pollution. Even pouring of things like cooking fat and oil down the drain, these actually also contribute to water pollution in some way, shape, or form. When we think about some of the detergents that we use, again, there are options that you can actually exercise in terms of purchasing, where you can buy phosphate-free detergent or dish cleaner. Phosphate is actually a substance, unfortunately, that leads to algae production and can actually be quite detrimental for ocean life and can contribute to water pollution, specifically overproduction of algae. Some of us are still exercising the practice of flushing old medications down the toilet or pouring them into the drain. Again, this is really something that we need to try to avoid if we're seeking to reduce the amount of pollution, water pollution that we're contributing. What can you do beyond this? Really, avoidance of plastic has become first and foremost in the minds of many individuals. We understand how detrimental plastic is to the environment in and of itself. We understand that there are things now like forever plastics that essentially are lingering in many of our waterways. And so trying to cut down on your consumption of plastic containers is actually one of the main ways in which you can help to reduce water pollution and pollution in general. There are a number of different organizations as well, so local environmental charities that are dedicated to really protecting our waterways. Save the Bay is actually the largest regional organization in our area that's working to protect, restore, and really preserve the San Francisco Bay and the water sources in and around it. Eating more organic food and actually reducing meat consumption is one that we may not think of, but is actually a way to help reduce water pollution as well. We understand that there are fewer chemicals that are actually used in producing organic food. We talked about how chemicals, pesticides, et cetera, get into our groundwater. And we know actually that raising animals for the purposes of mass meat production and consumption also contributes to groundwater pollution. Many of us who drive vehicles, especially if they're a little bit older, are cognizant of the fact that our cars may leak things like oil and other materials. But understanding that it's important to understand that that leakage of materials, when it rains and other sources of water essentially wash the streets clean, that material, the oil, whatever it is that may be coming from our car, that all ends up in a waterway of some sort. And so making sure that your car is not contributing itself to some of our water pollution. And then for those who may be very invested or very interested, you can actually always go and help to clean up a local beach, clean up a local lake. These opportunities are advertised very often through actually organizations like Save the Bay, as well as others. There are a couple of different devices that you can actually buy for the purposes of getting rid of contaminants in your drinking water. So I think many of us, if we had to boil down kind of our thoughts or concerns, would boil them down to, well, what can I do to really reduce the amount of contaminants in my drinking water, the water I'm using for consumption, cooking, et cetera, et cetera. And so many of us are actually familiar with a lot of the devices that are commercially available, including things like activated carbon filters. And we'll look at some pictures of some devices in just a second. But there are more advanced kind of filtering systems, if you will, beyond just your average Brita filter. You can actually even purchase some reverse osmosis filters and even ion exchange kind of systems as well. And you can see, depending on what it is that you actually use, you actually can eliminate different types of contaminants. And so your Brita filter, for example, is going to get rid of a lot of contaminants that we are particularly concerned about when it comes to health, and things that we want to make sure we're not consuming, including things like carbon tetrachloride, haloacetic acids, et cetera, et cetera. But if you were to purchase something like a reverse osmosis system, you would actually be able to eliminate all of these contaminants, but actually eliminate a number of the other contaminants that we talked about as well, and some that we didn't mention too. So what do these actually look like, and how much do they cost? So again, something like an activated carbon water filter, which is very easy to purchase, readily accessible as well. Many of us probably even have actually in our kitchen or in our refrigerator, something like a Brita filter. It differs quite a bit and is much less expensive compared to something like a reverse osmosis water filter, which is even less expensive than something like an ion exchange water filter. And so a lot more kind of work that needs to go into getting something like a reverse osmosis water filter set up, or an ion exchange water filter. And it just depends on how you want to approach essentially your drinking water. Again, thinking back to what we talked about, we understand that our drinking water in San Francisco is actually not bad in terms of the number of contaminants that are kind of above a range that we would like them. We're actually doing quite good. If you live outside of San Francisco, again, you would have to, investigate some other local sources of information with regards to the contamination of your drinking water. But if you live in San Francisco in and of itself, your drinking water itself is pretty good already. And so you may want to factor that into consideration if you think about additional devices or apparatus that you might purchase for the purposes of lessening water pollution. And then also there are a number of different kind of testing kits that you can actually purchase online. Many of them are relatively inexpensive, but you obviously get a range in terms of what you're able to detect, oftentimes depending on kind of the price and how comprehensive the tests are in and of themselves. The vast majority of the tests will actually detect different types of metals. They'll actually detect bacteria and other chemicals as well. And as I alluded to, many of these kits are actually readily available. You can purchase them from places like Amazon, Home Depot, somewhere as cheap as $10 to $15. Some of the more expensive kits actually, where you have a little machine included with the kits as well, can be in excess of $100. And so it's just dependent on kind of how much you want to invest into something like this. With that, I will go ahead and again, thank you all for your attention during this session, and happy to be able to entertain any questions at all about anything that I've mentioned.
I do have several questions for you, but I actually have one in regards to the unit measure that you talked about at the beginning, the ppb. What does that stand for, and how does that work? Oh, no, you're on mute.
Sure. In terms of, so are you talking about
when you were yeah, at the beginning, and it was showing the water quality in San Francisco and how it was measured. And I guess it was just a little confusing because the guidelines had a certain number, but then there was a large number that was a lot higher than those, but it was done, the measurement was done in ppb.
Yeah. So it's a little bit more on that. So in terms of the measurement, so ppb and ppm, ppb stands for parts per billion.
Okay.
So in terms of something like groundwater, for example, you're actually talking about, 1 part per billion is when you get a microgram, or essentially 1/1,000,000th of a gram of a contaminant that's present in kind of 1 liter of water or 1 kilogram of soil. So it's essentially parts per billion is actual actually the unit of measurement, ppm, would be parts per million, if I'm not mistaken. And so that's why some of the numbers may have looked, kind of quite different.
I get it.
In the different columns.
Okay. And then is aluminum getting into us through antiperspirants, cosmetics, and what about packaging and cookware? And then also aluminum foil. I mean, a lot of people use that as well.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So in terms of, whether or not aluminum is actually getting into our system through things like antiperspirants, I think there's still more research that is needed, but I think there is some additional evidence and mounting evidence that aluminum containing products, especially hygiene products, that are, being used in around the oral mucosa or underarms, et cetera, they're probably not the greatest for us. There probably is some level of systemic absorption that, we're better off honestly not having. I think this has been reflected in part by some of the companies themselves in switching over to aluminum-free products. So many companies that produce personal hygiene products now have really almost kind of entire aluminum-free lines of really the same product, whether it's, any perspirant or deodorant, et cetera. But they're all aluminum free. And I think it's come as a result actually of some of these concerns and some of the work that's been done into looking into this. In terms of, from an aluminum standpoint with our cooking, do we ingest aluminum as a result of using, aluminum cookware and things like that? My suspicion is also yes. I think you have to be careful with any type of cookware that you're using and what is potentially coated in and how that actually changes how that substance may change over the course of, thousands of cycles of being heated up and cooling down, heated up and cooled down, et cetera. So for example, many of the non-stick pans that we use, they're coated in things like Teflon and other substances where after a certain number of heating and cooling cycles, you start to actually get breakdown of some of that substance and you basically begin to ingest some of it. And so, I personally don't use non-stick pans anymore for that specific reason because of concerns actually about some of the materials in the cookware itself starting to degrade and you actually then ingesting it. Again, we're talking about very, very small amounts, obviously, but if you think about exposure length, a very small amount over a very, very long period of time still mounts and still adds up. And so it's unlikely from a single time of cooking, you get a massive exposure, massive toxic exposure, but you do have to think about, I think, just the repeated ongoing long-term exposures. And, obviously there's a lot more research that's needed to really understand the ins and outs of those micro exposures over a very long period of time. But I think there is good evidence so far to suggest that they do mount and they do cause health consequences sooner or later.
Also is there do we have our own internal way of filtering out some of these chemicals before it actually gets to our brain? I mean, I felt sorry for our kidneys and livers and stuff like that, but is there?
Yeah, so I think you highlighted correctly in that, the workhorses in terms of getting rid of a lot of these contaminants are really going to be the liver and the kidneys. We're really reliant upon them to remove many of the contaminants and toxins that we're exposed to. There are some things though that, may kind of escape the full filtration or full effect of the decontamination by our liver and our kidney. And so some of those things are going to actually get into the system, particularly the central nervous system, and they can actually cause damage even if you have a fully functioning liver and fully functioning kidneys that are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
And you kind of touched on this, but about the Brita filter, which I did see at Costco this weekend, it was about $50. So if anyone's interested, but let's see, how does a typical Brita help reduce water pollutants for home drinking water? And I think you kind of answered that. If you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I would say with your typical kind of Brita filter, which is going to be an activated carbon filter, you're getting rid of things like carbon tetrachloride, haloacetic acids, excuse me. Those are kind of the main things that you're getting rid of. And we know that those are detrimental for health in the long term as well. Some of the other things, so example, for example, your Brita filter isn't going to necessarily remove, things like chromium. It's not going to necessarily remove things like aluminum. You need a different system to be able to tackle those things. But again, thinking about the quality of our drinking water, at least in San Francisco, our drinking water, based on the data I presented, doesn't have super high levels of aluminum in it. It doesn't have super high levels of things like strontium in it, for example. And so you have to think a little bit about, the area I'm in, what's most likely in the water. And we did actually talk about carbon tetrachloride in San Francisco, but what's most likely in the water and what is the filter most appropriate for whatever's in the water?
Let's see, I spent a couple of years in the Middle East where they dumped a lot of chlorine in the water to purify it, wondering if 2 years of drinking a lot of, given the heat of what was basically swimming pool water, could have long-term effects on the brain.
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of chlorine specifically, I'm a little bit less familiar about the impact of chlorine in terms of neurological health. I haven't seen too many literature pieces really focused on whether or not chlorine increases your risk of something like a neurodegenerative condition, for example, whether or not, because it's so uncommon, I think, consumption of large amounts of chlorine. I haven't seen really too much research about that specifically. And so I would have to say, I think there's more work that's needed, and I'm a little bit less sure about chlorine in particular compared to some of the other things that we talked about.
This next question is about the current tertiary water treatment, only removing particles above a certain size and sterilizing water, but has there been studies looking at the health of people whose water is taken from rivers downstream of cities like Sacramento and Stockton?
Yeah, so specifically for cities downstream of kind of Sacramento and Stockton, cities in California in and of itself, I haven't come across too much. I think more of kind of what I have seen is research studies looking at different parts of the world where there's not as ready access to water treatment facilities in general. And so I think, the particle size itself that is actually filtered out of each contaminant is important, but the research I think hasn't quite gotten to that nuanced of a level. There's been more of an emphasis on, again, consumption of kind of untreated waters in, areas like Brazil, the river I talked about, other areas of the world as well, compared to actual consumption of treated water itself. So again, an area where a lot more work is needed.
Here's just a comment. It says, better than volunteering for a cleanup is voluntarily reducing your VMT, vehicle miles traveled. Imagine how our grandkids will think of us when we leave them a ruined planet because we like the convenience of taking the SUV to Starbucks. Oops, I think I might be guilty of that. So
yeah, and we talked a little bit about air pollution, right? And we talked about, our individual cars unfortunately contribute significantly to air pollution. And, air pollution results in water pollution, but air pollution itself actually is detrimental to human health from a variety of different standpoints. We actually know now it's detrimental to brain health from a standpoint of it actually may increase your risk of neurodegenerative disease. So there is actually some work that has been published that has shown an association between living in an area with very high levels of air pollution and actual incidence and prevalence of amyloid pathology, which is one of the pathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. That came out within the last couple of years, if I'm not mistaken. And so just another kind of, point around, we really need to try to reduce the amount of pollution we're generating, especially when it comes to personal vehicles and air pollution.
Here is another question in regards to the air pollution. Is I remember living in a smoke from steel production in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the exhaust from leaded gas. And this person actually loved the smell. So has there been studies looking to see if exposure to pollution like that is related to diseases showing in the current elderly?
Yeah, so as I was kind of alluding to, some of the most recent research has identified that living in areas of very high air pollution, again, those research studies, it's important to keep in mind that whenever you're talking about exposure to any sort of contaminant, pollutant, et cetera, you have to talk about the length of the exposure time, right? Exposure for one day is very different compared to exposure for 1 year, which is different compared to exposure for 10 years per se.
Mhm.
And so the research studies that I'm referring to, they don't necessarily have the longitudinal follow-up that really you need. But they're a step in the right direction in terms of kind of answering that question between what's the relationship between pollution and brain health. And as I mentioned, we know based on some of the recent research that living in very highly polluted areas, there is an association with degenerative conditions potentially later on in life. And they look specifically at Alzheimer's in this context that I'm referring to, but I would not be surprised if other individuals are actually looking at, the relationship between air pollution and things like Parkinson's, Lewy body disease. I'm sure that research is coming as well, just based on folks have been looking at Alzheimer's already.
We kind of touched on this earlier, but cast iron pans and health issues.
Yeah, so thinking about, like a cast iron pan, so I actually prefer cast iron pans to things like Teflon coated pans that are nonstick. And the reason for it is that if you think of a cast iron pan, so, folks who are very familiar with cast iron pans, to get the maximum use out of them, to get them to be most beneficial, you have to season a cast iron pan, right? Which involves you actually taking essentially a cooking oil, usually like a vegetable or something like that, coating the entire pan and then heating the pan to a very, very high temperature and then allowing it to cool, which basically creates almost like an artificial coat around the entire pan, which gives it kind of like a non-stick surface, right? But if you think about what's actually making that non-stick surface, it's actually a cooking oil. It's not something like a manufactured Teflon. And so I prefer cast iron pans actually for, non-stick purposes, because I think using kind of a good technique, you can actually avoid having to, cook food on things like Teflon and things like that. I think also I read about this a while back. If you look at cast iron pans, so you have to be mindful also of what you're cooking in your different cooking instruments, right? So if you're cooking something very acidic, you want to maybe use something like stainless steel, for example, as opposed to cast iron, because it will actually eat through your film. And there is a possibility, I think, with more acidic things, they can interact a bit more with the actual cast iron itself. So you want to be mindful of what you're cooking. But I think cast iron pans, they've been around really forever. And I still think they're probably one of the best ways to kind of cook, particularly if you're looking to avoid using like Teflon coated cooking appliances and things like that.
And then in terms of reporting levels of toxic by zip code or census tract, do you know of any statewide reporting system?
That's a really good question. I don't offhand, unfortunately. I'm sure they exist. I just don't know of any offhand, unfortunately. My apologies.
That's fine. And then any comments about pharmaceuticals getting into the water system?
Yeah, so again, I think, as I mentioned, there's some of us who still ascribe to the practice of kind of flushing pharmaceuticals down the toilet, which is not a great practice in and of itself. So they do get into the waterways. I think maybe, and I'm guessing, but I'm guessing maybe part of the question is, well, how substantial is actually this contribution to water pollution? And for example, is there a possibility that, there's such mass dump of pharmaceutical companies that pharmaceutical products into the water that I'm drinking, remnant opioids or something like that? I think that's really, really unlikely, just because the practice of dumping pharmaceuticals into kind of our water is less common than, say, dumping something like cooking oil or cleaning materials. Those are the bigger culprits in that mind. It still happens. It's still a contributing factor to, some of our water waste, but I think less so than some of the other things that I mentioned. So I'm kind of stepping on a ledge, assuming the question is about, well, could I be having negative side effects from basically medications in my water? I think that's pretty highly unlikely.
Yeah. Here's another question on copper pans. And the use of copper pans. I mean, I guess that kind of depends. I know that some are tin lined and some are stainless steel lined, but I mean, because you don't really cook on the copper itself. So.
Yeah, that's correct. So it depends on the lining specifically. So, you know, if you think about why copper is even in cooking materials is because copper is good with regards to, you know, heat control. It's used for specific, if I remember correctly, it's used specifically for that purpose. It helps specifically with heat control. And so the substance you're actually cooking on, though, is oftentimes not the copper itself. It is usually, right, if I remember correctly, most of the copper cooking products are actually lined with something else.
Right.
And so, you know, you have to think about what is that lining actually that they're using, that you're actually is coming into contact basically with the surface of your food and things like that. But the copper itself actually coming into contact, I'd be very surprised if it wasn't actually, it was actually the copper itself that was in contact with the food that's being cooked.
This is going to be our last question, but it kind of follows like a question that I have is like when you walk into a grocery store and basically you see aisles of things that will be dumped into the drain at one point or another, but is there has there been studies looking at the potential harm from all of these substances? I mean, because not everything is going to be removed, but and that would be substances of concern like chemicals, unabsorbed medicines, you know, the bleaches, the cleaners, all of the cleaners. I mean, are we doomed, I guess, is the question.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that, you know, when we think about water pollution in general, it's a big pie with many different pieces part of it, right? So obviously there are contributions from what we're seeing in the supermarket and what we're seeing in the grocery store each and every day. We're seeing some of that stuff obviously get into the waterways, but you have to think about the other things that are getting into the waterways as well. So if you think, for example, about a farmer who owns a significant amount of crop, and you think about the amount of pesticide, the amount of fertilizer that has to be used to keep that crop up and going. Say the farmer also has a significant number of livestock, all of the animal waste that's generated, all the things that have to be you know, used to make sure that the animals are growing and things like that. All of that is actually also ending up in the waterways. And so while our household chemicals and things like that, you know, they are noxious, they're not great to have in the waterways, I would argue they're still kind of a smaller piece of the pie, right? As opposed to some of the bigger things that we think about. And those you know, have to do with things like groundwater pollution, really from things like agricultural waste. You know, we know that for example, I mentioned it very briefly, but the #1 threat actually to water quality across the world is really nutrient pollution. So excessive amounts of nitrogen and things like that from fertilizer, pesticides, etc., which, you know, contribute to things like harmful algae growth. And so those honestly are doing probably more damage. Everything's doing damage, but those are doing damage to a larger extent than, you know, some of the things that are kind of right in the front of us. And so I would argue that, you know, if I'm looking at the bleach down one aisle and I'm looking at the freshly grown tomatoes and cucumbers and all the produce down the other aisle, I would actually argue the freshly grown produce is contributing just as much, if not probably more, to water pollution. In some, depending on how it's grown and how the farmers, you know, take care of it, but it's contributing just as much, if not probably even more, to our water pollution than some of the bleach and other chemicals being dumped in the water. And plastics obviously being probably the biggest challenge, I would say, for our current time in terms of pollution is the plastics. It's really gotten out of control, and obviously it's been in the news that it is going to wreck many an ecosystem if it's not brought under control quickly.
Well, has there been studies on the long-term plastic consumption? I mean, they're talking about the plastic from the cigarette butts. And basically kind of seems like we're all drinking that now. I mean,
yeah, I think in terms of the really longitudinal studies, those are, I'm sure, coming. I don't think they're here quite yet. I think one of the things with the plastics is we're just starting to really understand, honestly, how pervasive they are. The fact that I'm sure folks have seen in the news, they're finding some of these like forever plastics in the depths of the ocean where, human beings can't exist, where even life itself is very difficult to it's very difficult to find, yet you're finding actually some of these plastics. And so I think we're starting to understand just how pervasive the plastics are themselves. And as you alluded to, the fact that we're pretty much all consuming them in some way, shape, or form. What the long-term consequences, 20, 30, 40 years of that are, we don't know quite yet, but I think that research is coming, and I think it's probably going to be pretty alarming.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this great conversation and the information that you provided. And thank you everybody for joining us this week. We will be back next week with one more program, and we hope to see you then. And again, Dr. Windon, thank you so much for joining us today. See you guys later.